afternoon and welcome to PHDwin Week 2025. My name is Jim Tague and I am the president of the Performance Analytics Group, a small boutique firm that focuses on oil and gas reserves and valuations. I'd like to start by thanking all the good people at PHDwin for inviting me back to speak again this year. Last year, my talk focused on the inconsistencies between a reserve report and the real world. Why sometimes a nice reserve report fails to materialize in the real world. It's either not, volumes don't show up, or it's not monetized as people expected. And there were a lot of warning signs when this was about to happen. And that's what I covered. Got some good feedback on that. And thus, this year, I'd like to dig in on one aspect of that, especially on a subject that is becoming more and more relevant as the days go by. Literally, new regulations are coming out every month dealing with P&A and ARO costs and how we deal with them. And that's what I'm going to focus on. Now, in general, this talk is going to be high level. I'm not going into the nuts and bolts, how to load P&A costs or the timing and stuff into PHDwin itself. I'm going to be more trying to make you aware of what we're dealing with and how we now have to be cautious when it comes to P&A and ARR costs. There are some real inconsistencies between the way we have to approach it and what happens in the real world. And that's what this talk is going to focus on. So let's jump right into the presentation. And I'd like to start by addressing why I feel P&A costs are now becoming more relevant to the way we calculate and certify reserves. When I started long ago, I spent most of my time on, decline curves, the costs associated with it, the volumes, the timing of the PUDs, all that good stuff, the capital expenditures. And it was almost an afterthought where I would throw in a P&A cost. And sometimes I'd even play the game of trying to zero it out with salvage costs. It was just sort of something that was out there, use some historical costs and just threw it in there. The timing, sometimes it was set automatically, other times I pushed it out. But it was not a central focus of my reserve valuations. That is changing for a number of reasons. And probably the primary reason why is the whole issue of plugging and abandonment, idle wells, orphan wells, is now in the public domain, especially over the last 5 years. There isn't a major news outlet that hasn't run a story on the orphan wells and this massive unfunded liability that sits out there for many states. They're seizing on the idle wells belonging to a large number of companies. You can go out there and Google and pull down reports from pretty ardent environmentalists like the Sierra Club that are all over this issue. And that leads to the environmental pressure here. They are certainly using it to make hay and to try to increase scrutiny and regulatory regulation on our industry. And they're having success. Politicians are listening. Bills have been passed here in Texas and in California and others dealing with this issue. California, I'll cover that in a little bit. The costs are pretty onerous. It's a definitive issue out there. Now that regulations are being passed, obviously the energy finance community, the banks, are very aware of this. They have their own means of calculating P&A liabilities, and there's thresholds that they just will not finance you. Good luck trying to get an RBL on an asset, even though if it's very cash flowing and it's a profitable asset right now, is sitting out there with a large unfunded or a future P&A liability. You won't get financing for it. There's reasons for that, and but basically they just don't want to take the risk that that unfunded liability, should the person who acquires it, the operator, go bankrupt, and somehow that liability boomerang onto them. With the banks doing it, and definitely with publicly traded companies. The SEC now has pretty strict requirements on what needs to be reported in financial and public statements, and they require you to go into pretty substantial detail on the timing and the total costs that you would face as a publicly traded oil and gas company. So before we go much further, knock out a little bit of schoolwork, as I call it. Some definitions. I think everybody here is fairly aware of what P&A and ARO, they are often used interchangeably within our industry, but and they refer to the costs that are, abandoning a well, cutting off the casing, plugging, surface equipment removal, basic remediation, all that good stuff. Is there a difference? Well, ARO actually has a accounting definition and is used in GAAP accounting under federal accounting standards. It is a legal term, and you certainly find it in the public documents of publicly traded companies. In the reserve world, we tend to use the term P&A, throw that around a little more often. Simply put, ARO, P&A, whatever you want to use, these are unavoidable legal and financial obligations. And in many cases, they may be underreported, underestimated, and as far as timing, that's a whole issue in and of itself that causes a lot of difficulty in the reserve world. But it's important to be aware of this. Why does it matter? Well, as we all know, just from our basic days as a baby reserve engineer, P&A liabilities impact the NPV of a well. Runs out, time's on the end, can impact the NPV of a well, project, entire entity. Just preaching to the choir there, we know that. Timing of P&A is difficult to predict. And of course, because whether you push it out, bring it up, either way, it has, with a discounting factor, if you're using a PV10, either can almost be erased. If you shove a P&A liability out 10, 20 years, it's discounted down to very minimal. But if you bring it up, it can be right there. And I'm going to cover some of the regulations, especially in California, now that they are requiring operators, in some cases, to abandon 20% of their idle wells a year with very little room for extensions. So suddenly what might have been discounted out into the future is now a significant real cash expense. Deferred unfunded P&A exposes companies to regulatory, environmental, and financial risk. Just talk to the reserve engineers of the large publicly traded companies and the SEC, and they will certainly emphasize this with an exclamation point. More holistically, the orphan wells, we don't deal with that in the reserve world too much. But when we have all this P&A liability that we've calculated, and if that operator, that company goes under, that liability now goes to the state funds. And we're seeing this more and more. Orphan well programs are growing. Let's face it, I've looked at some companies and working on some analysis. I can name off 20, 50, 60 producers here in Texas, operating companies that are producing less than 50 barrels a day, but have over 300 wells in their well count. Do the math. It doesn't work. At that low of production, your cash flow, do a simple calculation on the potential P&A liability out there. You're looking at 12 to 15 years of their cash flow would have to be used to plug out all those wells. And we know that's not going to happen. Those are eventual, some environmental groups have now categorized those, but yes, they're out there. They will go bankrupt in the end, and the state's going to pick up the cost of that abandonment. So lots of reasons why this needs to be addressed, from the detailed reserve level all the way up to being aware of it in our industry. So now that we've sort of introduced the topic of P&A costs, let's dive into some details. Let's take a look at reserves versus reality. What's on paper? What is really going on out there? I think all of us have a sense of this, but I want to put it down in a presentation so you can really grasp what we're dealing with. So let's look at accounting for P&A and reserves. Again, this is sort of a school slide. Most of you are highly aware of this, work with this every day, but just to review, accounting for P&A. Regulations require P&A costs to be included in the economic limit test. But if you look, SPE, PRMS, SPEE, there is not a lot of guidance out there. I mean, boy, you look into those documents as far as how you classify a well, how much you can, the spacing, the rules, you name it. We have a lot of guidance that helps us do our job. The people who put that together are amazing people in our industry, and they're really out for our interests. There's, things push come to shove on a legal basis on a reserve report. As long as you're following the PRMS, SEC guidance, you're in good shape. Great detail. But again, go back and Google, look at your PRMS, go look at your documents. Maybe those of you who work for a reserve firm may have some good internal guidance. If so, I wish you would publish that out on the public domain. There's not a lot out there. PRMS outlines, principles of reserve classification, but gives minimal detail on P&A estimation. Actually, these documents provide a great deal of flexibility, more than you will find in many other areas of how we do our reserve calculation. It's almost like in some cases, they're very specific. How you classify this here, they give you flexibility, which is a good thing, but it can lead to inconsistent reporting across companies. Sometimes if you're the company reserve auditor or reserve generator and you're working with the outside auditor, there can be a lot of arguing over the timing and costs associated with reserves. The application guidelines, facts that have been published by the SPE and so forth offer some examples, but again, no standard method for calculating P&A and reserve models. Result of this is that most of us, I say most companies, most of us apply flat generic costs regardless of well complexity, depth, or geography. We'll go off of historical AFEs. We'll use the state sort of funding per foot type of requirements. That's what we do, but again, no specificity. Back, let's look at a reserve definitions, frequently answered questions, frequently asked questions. Read it. While abandonment costs are expected to be included in cash flow forecasts used to determine economic limit, does not prescribe specific methods for estimating these costs. Engineering judgment is required and methods may vary. Let that sink in. Engineering judgment is required. We should apply a reasonable, supportable method for estimating well abandonment costs. These may be based on internal historical data, analog wells. They are very aware, though, that simplistic flat per well assumptions may not reflect true field conditions. SBE advises that estimates be documented, reviewed periodically, and adjusted for inflation, complexity, regulatory conditions, and site-specific factors. There's your guidance. The longer you've been in the industry, the more you've seen, probably the more accurate you are and the more knowledgeable you are. But if you're fairly new to this industry, fairly new to reserves, like I said, there's not a lot out there to go by. And that's what I want to make you aware of and try to give you some guidelines for the rest of this talk. That was the reserve world. Let's look at P&A in the real world. Reserve report assumptions rarely match real world outcomes. That I can tell you, especially when it comes to timing and cost. In fact, in the reserve world, reserve counting, P&A is applied at the end of life, and idle wells are addressed using state requirements. So that's another layer of complexity coming in. P&A may kick in, once a well goes uneconomic, it may kick in a year after, maybe 2 years after. And then if you have an idle well inventory, it's just the number of percentage that are abandoned using state requirements. That's pretty accurate. But in the real world, idle wells, P&A, the timing is usually pushed way out there. There's extensions giving. There's things you can do. Most operators try to push that cost out as far as they can. And that sometimes leads to arguments. If you're on the company side versus the auditor side, the timing, et cetera, can lead to, let's just call it discussions. We tend to use in the reserve world, P&A costs, sort of flat generic ones. Any of you been on the operations side know that there is no generic cost. Maybe the stripper wells in West Texas, standard San Andres, I would feel pretty accurate using an AFE, but in more complex geological settings, you know, why is a well idled? Maybe because there's a bunch of junk stuck down that hole that's going to cost too much to fix, and therefore the well's not economic to bring back on. And that's not going to be an easy abandonment. California, they want to see you tag bottom. It can get very expensive. And I've dealt with this. $50,000 abandonment becomes $500,000 because we have split casing and junk in the hole. And at the time, Dogger, now CalGem, would not approve an abandonment until we could tag bottom. $500,000 to abandon that well. So we all know that there's significant variation here. Right now, state and federal regulations are evolving rapidly, and they are pushing for earlier abandonment, full funding. Operators are facing pressure to shorten the timeline between well shut-in and actual plugging activity. This disconnect on how things are treated in the reserve world, the operator world, and the changing dynamics of the operator world lead to concern over how we deal for these costs. So how do you reconcile the differences? The SPE says engineering judgment, and then trying to use as much historical and analog data as you can. And that's where we have to start. We simply have no other way to go much further in that. But I feel one way to address this and see if there's inaccuracies in your reserve report is to break this P&A cost into several components. First one is timing. When in a reserve report do you account for the P&A costs? And then how does it fit in the real world? Well, in a reserve model, it affects the PV10, due to discounting, pushing costs too far forward, sorts it, pushing it way out there gives you a benefit. Reserve models actually often accelerate the abandonment costs while real-world operators attempt to defer it. What do I mean by this? When I do a reserve report, when a well goes uneconomic, I will usually use a 2-year. I'll give a 2-year window, and then the P&A cost comes a 2-year lag, P&A costs. Real world, we know they're seeking extensions. They are kicking that thing down the road 10, 15, 20 years. So a reserve report actually may be more onerous as far as timing and the discounted amount of that dollar amount. Costs. We go off historical and AFEs. These can be fairly accurate in the near term, but there's a dirty little secret in the industry with your idle wells, especially if you're given you have to buy idle so many in a year. You do the cheap ones first. You are not, by and large, most of them are not going in and fixing that well that's going to cost $500,000 because it has split casing and junk in the hole. They're going to do the cheap ones first and keep punting those out into the future. So reconciling this, like I said, best thing to do is to look at the timing and the costs and approach each one separately. So let's start with the timing of P&A liabilities, reserves versus reality, and dive a little deeper into this subject. P&A timing in reserve reports. For producing wells, P&A timing is usually based on the economic limit. Of course, we know what the definition of economic limit is, but it's when the revenue no longer covers operating expenses, boom, cuts off the future volumes of production in our reserve report. automatically calculated for us by PHDwin. I tend to use in certain cases 2 years after the economic limit, 1 year after the economic limit. Of course, this always causes significant anger, I would say, in the company level when you're loading in, if you're a bank and you're loading in a very conservative price deck in a low price environment, and a lot of good wells are getting, shut in, hit the ECL, and then bam, this huge P&A starts landing in, and the reserve report looks like junk. Some you can get real technical in there. Is loss okay for a year, especially if you got this strange sort of strip price in the future that goes down, then up. We have to watch that, deal with that. So definitely an issue there that sometimes we have to deal with. Gets a little more complicated when we're dealing with non-producing wells, shut-in wells, i.e. idle wells. Timing is more complex and definitely less standardized. In most cases, we will refer to the state idle well rules out there to determine the timing. And there's so many that will have to be abandoned each year, 10%, 20%, 2%, etc. These rules vary significantly by state jurisdiction. Some require P&A within 12 months, out to 60 months. I believe in Colorado now, don't quote me on this, I think it's 4 years. You can't even kick them. I don't even think they give extensions. Here, engineering judgment plays a larger role, and this can introduce the inconsistencies that I've mentioned. The timing, obviously how you account for the P&A, either a producer or any of the other classifications categories, is a key driver of the PV10. It lands on there, and if you can shove it out 10 years, the discounts to nothing. But those days are going by the wayside. It's going to be much more rigorous and accounted for. P&A timing in the real world, starting to be more and more driven by reserve regulations and rules. It is a complex issue and is causing significant concerns and lobbying for regulations or against regulations. Not my world, but it's out there. Let's face it, in the real world, there may be a few cases, but I've never really seen a well that goes, boom, it's economic limit, the operator shuts it in, and in 2 years or whatever the idle well rule, it's applied. No, that doesn't happen. Many cases, a well will go idle. And the reasons for that, it may be low price, and that's easy to deal with. We've all worked through those. But a well may be, like I said, have a significant downhole issue. And it just doesn't make sense in $60 oil to go back and spend the money to get that well back online. It's a stripper well, and it's just not worth it. It'll be idle, and then it can sit there for a long time. Maybe it comes back on. So yes, reserves can probably be more aggressive on the timing when it comes to applying a P&A cost, especially because wells in real life go idle for a substantial period of time before they're P&A'd. Extensions in Texas, it's not difficult to get an extension from an engineer that says why this well could be brought back on in future life. So timing's pushed out there. As I've mentioned briefly earlier, and why this has become a concern of politicians, is unfortunately there are operators out there that continue to operate without plugging, and then they're going to declare bankruptcy to avoid the P&A costs, and those become orphan wells, and they land on the state's books to clean up. Argument on that, and where some rules may come in, but this doesn't apply in the reserve world, but just something you need to be aware of, is there's lots of arguments on the blanket bond. I think in Texas, you can go up to 100 wells and it's $50,000. Over that, it's $200,000. Nowhere do I know in this state where you can abandon 100 wells for less than $50,000. So the blanket bond requirements are, de minimis, and of course, environmentalists hate that. We're seeing rule changes there, but again, that really doesn't refer to the reserve world, but it certainly impacts the P&A and how operators abandon wells in the real world. Let's look at some of the regulations that are now coming out dealing with abandonments. Recently passed Texas Idle Well Regulation, Senate Bill 1150. Mandates plugging and reactivation. Inactive wells that have remained unused for 15 years or more than 25 years post-completion must now be plugged or returned to operation. There was some pushback, obviously, from the industry on this, but by and large, not as much as I expected. The industry knows this can be an issue, and they're trying to be proactive. So kudos to us. The Railroad Commission will start to enforce this 7, and then this is where the extensions come in, the exceptions, judgment. So the environmentalists hate this slide right here. You can defer some of your idle well costs, demonstrated history of reactivating wells. If you have a financial hardship, that's a good one, because a lot of this can get triggered if we have another $30, $40 oil price and we go idle for a while. We don't want to trigger in all these idle well abandonments. Submission of performance bond. In other words, this is above the blanket bond, and you could submit an approved compliance plan committed to plug these wells out by 2040. So depending on how you play this out, you'd still have to abandon a certain amount of wells per year. And this is something you'd have to work with. If one of your client companies is a Texas company, you're definitely going to have to work with them and take a look at this compliance plan, or work in an ARO, because it's accounting on the side, a plan to account for these idle well costs and P&A costs. And let's look at Colorado. A little more strict here, as expected. They passed a rule in 2023. Or if you were sort of grandfathered in, you had a certain number of idle wells on December 31st, 2023, you had to abandon 1 to 10 wells by 2027, 11 to 50 by 2028, so forth. After 2023, idle wells must be plugged within 4 years. The company has 4 years to either get that well back online or plug it out. That actually makes our job easier as a reserve auditor. You can just put a 4-year or 2-year, split the difference, and add those costs in. How do you deal with some of these extraneous costs are out there? A company may say that's a corporate cost, therefore it's not in the reserve report. But Colorado now has an orphaned oil and gas well enterprise. Basically, they are collecting 125 or 225 per well annually at the production level. This is a tax that goes into a fund to abandon the orphaned wells. How you account for that? I haven't had to do this. I haven't done Colorado reserves. Do you just build this in as an LOE cost on each well, or do you keep it at the corporate level? That's a good question. If somebody has an answer for that, please let me know. California. Is California a harbinger of what is to come? I hope not. I'll sidebar on this and get away from that. But California recently passed a rule that states if you buy a property in California, even a small one, that blanket bond, that 50,000, that 200,000, no longer applies. The CalGEM will come in and they will take a look at the entire P&A liability, that entire asset, from every single well to the tanks to surface reclamation, and that amount is what you must bond. So look at it in the last 2 years since this bill has passed. Oil and Gas Clearinghouse, Energy Net, any of these, I don't think I've seen a sale of an oil and gas property in California. It basically killed what I call the aftermarket, the secondary sale of assets that are a lifeblood of the smaller E&P industry. If I wanted to go out there, let's say I buy a field for 100 barrels a day, and it was 30, 40 wells, I used to be able to post a $200,000 bond with the state of California. Now they would come in and they would look at that 40, 50 wells, apply $200,000, $300,000 to abandonment, $15 million, and then put, oh, the surface of the tanks, that's got to be gone. And say, if you want to buy that, you got to post a $20 million bond. Most small companies can't do that. So they've done that, and now they've passed in December of last year a new idle well program. They had a fairly rigorous one in place, but now on top of that bill that stops people from punting future bankruptcies to small companies, they put this in here. May 1st each year, you have to pay a fee for idle well. If it's less than 3 years, 1,000, 7 years, you can see here. If that well's been idle for a while, it's costing you a lot of money. 29 onwards, it's going to be, could be $60,000 per well if that well's 25 years of age, or actually in this case, 25 years idle. It's going to cost you $60,000 not to plug that well. Here's the other requirements. If you don't want to plug, you can either pay that fee and not plug it, but if you don't, here's what you're required to do. By 2030, 8% if you're 0 to 250 wells, idle well. But basically, if you got 3,000 wells and idle well, I've got some numbers here I'm going to share with you. 20% a year, you have to clean up your idle well inventory in a very short time. Just throw some numbers. That seems a little large out there, but Era Energy in 2020 had almost 8,000 idle wells. California Resources had over 4,000. They're combined now, so that's 12,000 idle wells. So obviously they're going to be starting abandoning 15 to 20% a year. That's a real cost. Smaller ones like Berry Petroleum, 2,000 plus wells, Sentinel Peak, in excess of 1,000, E&B Natural Resources, 1,000. So there's some significant idle well counts out there, and these are now, under this rule, these are significant and real costs and timing that they have to deal with. So with the timing of P&A, I showed how they're in the reserve world, we're actually probably more strict than the real world, and we should be, given all the news and regulations and stuff like that coming out. Let's look at the costs of P&A now. And here I would submit to you that we may be underestimating things, and the reason for that. So let's look at how we account for costs, or summarize what we do in the reserve world. Inputs, we usually use historical AFE averages from recent P&A jobs, very accurate. Will qualify for most certifications. We use state published cost schedules, per foot rates. Texas has a good one by, district and so forth. Like I said, Texas Railroad Commission, district specific average cost per foot, applied to the well's measured depth. This is often used for financial assurance calculations. If you've ever tried to bond as a small company, whatever, they calculate the amount of feet you have and total wellbore depth, and will apply a cost to that, and that's what you'll bond. This sometimes can be more, actually much higher number than a blanket bond. However, these methods are sort of how we calculate it, do admit site-specific geology, different completion styles, complex completions, and of course, we're not required to put inflation factors on. I mean, you might, but you don't have to put inflation factors or cost variability in on this. So while we have pretty formulaic way to approach costs, they don't always reflect what's going on in the real world. So P&A costs in the real world, they often exceed reserve report estimates due to complex wellbore configurations and well integrity issues. Like I mentioned previously, wells that go idle, yes, some have either just watered out, produced out. They're, just uneconomic. It doesn't make sense to produce them anymore. But a vast majority, no, got to be careful when I use that type of language. There are many cases of stripper wells that are idle because there was a well failure, and it just simply, it wasn't worth spending the $25,000 or $50,000 to bring a 1 to 2 barrel a day well back online. So it goes idle, not because it was uneconomic, but because the fix makes it uneconomic, which means the abandonment is going to be more expensive because there could be junk down that hole. Like I said, collapsed casing. I remember when I was doing early P&A costs and just putting in per well, I never really considered the site side. I didn't go out and see if there were, rotten tank batteries that have leaked all over the place, if the ground was a mess. Sure, if there's a rancher out there, we'd hear about it, but many cases I never factored that in. That's going to be more and more prevalent. Understanding exactly the condition of the surface facilities. I'll sidebar here, but back to the costs. I remember as a baby reserve, company reserve guy, and we had a bunch of shallow wells, and I would literally say, and they were cheap, at that time, we're talking, early 2000s, $10,000 could abandon a well here in this field. Salvage. I would say the pumping unit on that well and the tubing and everything is actually worth more than the P&A costs, and I was allowed to zero out the P&A costs. In real life, costs in the real world, anything of salvageable value, a pumping unit, etc., has long been moved off that wellbore and being used somewhere else before you abandon it. So there's usually not a lot of salvage value that you can net out against the cost. And if there is junk, if there is stuff down the hole, it's because it's stuck there. Operators may defer abandonment. No, they will, of wells with known downhole mechanical issues. You're going to try to kick that one off because they're going to be expensive. In high-cost wells requiring specialized equipment or deep plugs, it's just common sense. Sites with extensive surface infrastructure needing full remediation. I have known of fields that have extensive, piping, underground systems. How many of us, maybe I'm sure there's some of you that are on top of this, but how many of us have really gone out and when you try to calculate the cost of the final reclamation when the field goes uneconomic, have taken a look at those large gas processing plants. I've worked for people who've had gas processing plants that were built in the 50s and 60s, and those are not going to be easy to remediate. They could have asbestos and other chemicals. So, how do you account for that cost other than going out and literally hiring an environmental consulting firm or, a consulting firm that specializes in PA to do a site visit? And that gets very expensive. That can make a reserve report extremely expensive. So in the real world, the costs are often more than what we put in a reserve report. And what this does is it creates a backlog of expensive wells that really don't show up in our reporting. So a little comparison here, $25 per foot, 15 per foot, past AFE, state tables, minimal surface remediation, real world, $30 to $60 per foot is not uncommon. Costs vary, well-aged location, completion type. I mean, that's something that I never did. I have a field with 400 wells, and the P&A liability would be the exact same for a well that was drilled 4 years ago to the one that was drilled 50 years ago that may really have some downhole junk. I never adjusted for the age of the well. Been guilty as accused. Pad tank removal. I didn't do a lot of field audits to see exactly what we're dealing with when I calculated these costs. So yes, there is a potential that we are underestimating the actual liabilities of reserve plugging costs compared to the real world. So to wrap up this presentation, Uh, like I said, this is not a hard, I'm teaching you skill sets to use in PhDwin. This is an awareness talk. Show you these issues that we must deal with and help you come up when like the guide says, use engineering judgment. I hope to provide you with some information to help you use maybe even better judgment or more awareness when you have to deal with P&A costs. So let's just quickly summarize real-world impacts of P&A scrutiny, why it is important upon us as a profession, those of us who use PhDwin, to really start not only calculating accurate P&A costs, but to document it, to be able to justify why you timed it and use the cost you did. Mainly, if those of you are working for companies that have energy lenders, banks, private equity, there's a good chance they're going to dig in on it, especially if you seek more funding. They're really starting to look at how you book these liabilities. It reduces, if you have a lot of idle wells, your borrowing base capacity is going to be reduced. P&A assumptions can shrink that value of that reserve-based loan. I do not feel for the California companies that made these ones I mentioned that had these large amount of idle wells, and under the new rules, suddenly you can't push that idle well out 10 years anymore. If you're a large number, you got to start booking 20% each year. And that's the discount factor goes away. It is right there, and it bumps, takes a hit on your RBL base. Geographic redlining. For that reason, there are many, many energy lenders that will not even fund an acquisition in California. Good luck trying to raise money if you ever decide to go there. Colorado's not far behind. Some are getting leery of that. Louisiana, that's sort of been a litigious state based on other legal issues, but you put this on top of it, they're going to take a very hard look at the P&A if you try to get funding for a Louisiana acquisition. The risks, future cost inflation, etc. I've covered this. I won't labor it. It's all right there. But disputes in M&A valuations due to plugging liabilities. I remember having some arguments with a bank engineer. He won on this. We were trying to buy something, and yes, it had a P&A liability, and they aggressively, there were 60 idle wells, and they simply said all were going to be abandoned within 2 years and hit the NPV of this acquisition hard, such that we weren't competitive on our bid. And I tried to argue, there's no way, there's no requirement to abandon all 60 idle wells in this period of time, but bank was being conservative, as they probably should. So it does have an impact, and you'll see it more and more. So where do we go from here? My sort of divining of the future. You can expect continued strict enforcement of timing rules and reserve reports, despite the real world trends of trying to push that out, but the regulations are now closing that gap. Greater scrutiny, actual plugging and abandonment costs, potential legal investor and lender pressure on that. Again, sidebar here, I've read, and some of you may have heard of some very nasty regulations dealing with this. One is probably not going to gain traction, didn't make it in California, but it was proposed that, the operators who you go in and you buy a field now, not only do you have to bond it at the true plugging costs, there's no LLC protection anymore. Any acquisition would require a personal letter of guarantee, which means if you're an operator and you play that game, which gives our industry a black eye, but you're producing away, and then you declare bankruptcy and throw all those wells to the state to clean up, they will come after you personally. They can pierce that veil through the LLC. Now, that law didn't pass, but that's the type of things they're talking about. That's what gets banks nervous. The bigs, won't name, but the bigs, they're always worried that a state of California is a small operator that bought wells from them a long time ago, goes bankrupt, that the state's going to come after, the Chevrons or whatever and make them pay for it, even though they sold the company, all the liabilities, everything. Very difficult legal environment. So expect that type of attention and issues. Future reserve audits. How's it going to impact audits? Don't see it getting there because of the expense involved, but in some cases, site visits. Private equity firms who are much more attuned to this, they may want to see some actual site visits, especially if it's offshore platforms or estuary platforms. A lot of nasty stuff sitting in some of those bays out there that are basically uneconomic, but they continue to burp oil and gas just so you can avoid an abandonment cost. So I know they're out there. Deeper technical reviews of downhole well conditions, age of wells. Maybe that's going to have to be starting to factor in. A tighter scrutiny on the field level cleanup, especially in urban environments. Los Angeles and the downtown ones, I don't want to fathom what it could cost to abandon some of those old sites to true, new standards. So be aware of this. This is coming. Those of you who do reserves and audits for California companies are probably way on top of this and know more about this than I do. But for the rest of us who have been sort of Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, much more friendly environments, I think it's a good idea to watch what's going on out there and to see how both banks, energy finance, and the SEC and public companies deal with this, how they address it. So that's my advice. A lot in this presentation. I probably repeated myself a few times. Lots of stats going back and forth. Might have misstated something. If I did, please email me, text me, let me know that I misspoke on something. But again, this speech, this talk was for awareness. And I hope you gained from it. If you have any questions, I'll be around for the Q&A. And if you want to go deeper on this subject, always feel free to reach out to me. Thanks. Enjoy the rest of your day.